My name is Lena Whitaker, and I am 31 years old, at 7:42 p.m. On Saturday, June 14, during my parents' 35th anniversary banquet at the Grove Park Inn in Asheville, North Carolina. My mother smiled at a projector screen, showing a quitclaim deed with my name forged across the bottom. The room smelled of buttercream softening under warm banquet lights. Forks clinked low against salad plates while 180 guests watched the screen, and the linen napkin under my left hand had gone slick from being twisted too tightly between my fingers. I remember the projector fan clicking once, then settling into its soft electric hum. At 7:42 that night, my mother smiled at a projector screen showing a quitclaim deed with my name forged across the bottom. Then my father told 180 relatives, church friends, roofing clients, and neighbors that I had finally stopped being ungrateful and signed away my share of Grandma Ruth's mountain cabin. My mother touched one pearl earring, the way she always did when she wanted a lie to look polite. My father lifted his glass and looked directly past me, toward my brother Travis at the front table. Then Marcia Whitaker said, "After everything we have done for you, Lena, don't stand here acting ungrateful." I did not stand. I did not cry. I looked at the deed on the screen and saw 4 mistakes before my father finished his sentence. By midnight, Grandma Ruth's quilt had done what my family never expected. It remembered me. Welcome back to the channel, where we tell calm, true-to-life dramas about women who were underestimated until the paperwork, the witnesses, and the truth finally caught up. If stories about quiet strength and earned consequences matter to you, subscribe and stay with us. Drop your city and what time it is below. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now let me take you back to the first time my family mistook silence for permission. I was 8 years old the first time I understood that my family only respected work they could hear. It was 6:18 p.m. in the Whitaker family kitchen, the night before my 3rd grade county history presentation. I had spent 9 evenings making a poster about Buncombe County land grants with Grandma Ruth sitting beside me at her small oak table, teaching me how to label index cards by year, name, and acreage. I had 14 cards lined up in order: 1792, 1,804, 1,817, 1,831. Each one had my careful printing across the top and Ruth's pencil mark in the corner, where she had checked my spelling. The kitchen smelled like fried onions and roofing tar from my father's boots by the back door. Don Whitaker had come home late from a roofing job with sawdust trapped under one thumbnail and a smear of black sealant near his wrist. My poster board scratched both of my wrists because I had carried it home without a folder, holding it out from my body for 6 blocks in the damp March air so the glue would not buckle. Travis was 5 then. He had taped 2 magazine photos to a science board and drawn a sun in orange marker. My mother set his board on the counter like it belonged in a museum. She called Don over to look. He smelled like tar and sweat and cold wind, and when he leaned down to examine Travis's crooked tape, his face changed into the proud expression he kept for things that looked like him. I waited beside the table with my poster resting against my knees. Travis had misspelled planet as planet. My mother laughed and said that was how little inventors spelled things before the world caught up with them. My father put one heavy hand on Travis's head and said the boy had an eye for building. Then he turned toward me. He looked at my 14 index cards, the county map I had colored with 3 shades of green, the old names Ruth had helped me pronounce, the thin red string connecting land grants to present roads. He did not ask what any of it meant. He tapped one card with the end of his fork and said, "Travis builds things. Lena just copies what other people already wrote down." My mother said my father was teasing. He was not. Travis ate 2 biscuits with honey while my poster leaned against the chair leg. The honey made his fingers shine. My wrists were still scratched from the cardboard edge. I remember because I rubbed the marks under the table and counted 5 red lines on my left wrist, 3 on my right. Grandma Ruth came by at 7:04 to drop off a casserole dish. She did not argue with Don. Ruth rarely gave a loud person the gift of louder opposition. She stood in the doorway for 11 seconds, long enough to hear my mother praising Travis for taping his photos straight. Then, she looked at my poster. She did not smile too quickly. She studied it. That was one of the first things Ruth ever gave me. Study instead of performance. She picked up my index cards one by one and moved them into a shoebox from the pantry. The box smelled faintly of detergent and dust. She wrote Lena County Project on the lid in blue ink. Then she pressed the lid down until the corners clicked. Records only looked quiet, she told me, to people who did not know how to read them. The next morning, I stood in front of 23 children and one teacher and explained how land did not simply belong to the person who shouted about it. It belonged to the person who could trace it. I did not say that last part out loud. I was 8. I knew when a room did not want the whole lesson. 9 years later, after my high school graduation, my mother hosted a cake reception in the church fellowship hall. I was 17, and the room smelled like coffee urns that had been left on too long, and lemon cleaner still wet beneath the serving table. 42 folding chairs scraped against tile as people moved toward the cake, and I counted 9 blue balloons, all tied around the table where Travis's junior varsity football plaque sat in the center. My acceptance card was not on the display table. I had received a scholarship to study archival science and public history. The envelope had arrived 16 days earlier. Heavy cream paper with my name printed correctly. I had set it on the kitchen counter beneath a magnet shaped like North Carolina, but by the morning of the reception, the card had disappeared into the drawer where Marcia put things she did not want guests to ask about. Travis was 14. His football plaque had a small dent on the corner because he had dropped it in the parking lot. My mother placed it between 2 framed photos of him in uniform and told every church lady that he was finding his direction. When I asked where my card had gone, she adjusted the tablecloth, touched her pearl earring, and said, "Don't make a scene, Lena. People came to celebrate the family, not your little folder program." My little folder program, that was what she called 4 years of study, 3 recommendation letters, and the first piece of mail that had ever made me feel taller when I carried it. I ate cake from a paper plate that tasted faintly of freezer and sugar. Ruth sat beside me without asking permission and slid the missing acceptance card beneath my dessert plate with a folded $50 bill tucked inside. The bill smelled like her cedar drawer. The card had one corner bent from being hidden too long. I learned that night that my mother did not forget public recognition. She arranged it. At 24, I had already been working for the county long enough to know that basements could save families from losing land they had paid taxes on for 60 years. One November church dinner, after I helped recover missing land records for 3 local families, Dawn introduced me to a roofing client near the coffee urn as our quiet filing girl. The fellowship hall smelled of ham glaze and wet wool coats. My name tag said Leah in black marker. 3 families had brought thank you cards in white envelopes, and Marcia left them stacked near the coffee pot where spilled cream made rings on the tablecloth. Dawn laughed with his client and said, "She dusts old folders for the county. Somebody has to like basements." The client's aunt was one of the people whose property I had helped protect. She started to correct him, then looked at Dawn's face and stopped. I noticed. I always noticed. By then, Grandma Ruth had become the only person in the family who asked me questions and waited for the answers. In October 2018, 2 years before she died, I drove to her porch in Black Mountain after work. I was 23. The porch boards were cold through my socks because I had taken off my shoes at the door, the way Ruth liked. The air smelled of cedar smoke and damp leaves, and somewhere down the slope a dog barked 3 times, then went quiet. Ruth sat in her porch chair beneath a yellow lamp, hand-stitching a blue and white quilt with a silver thimble on her middle finger. Her hair had gone thin at the temples, but her hands were steady. Not quick, steady. She had courthouse receipts beside her in labeled envelopes, each one clipped to a small index card, book numbers, page numbers, filing dates, the kind of things my father called old paper until he needed one of them to save him money. She asked me to read a receipt number aloud from a folded slip. I did. She had me repeat it twice. I thought she was testing my attention. Later, I understood that she was teaching me the shape of a clue. Ruth said families often spoke in feelings when property was involved, but counties spoke in books, pages, dates, seals, and signatures. She said the word signatures slowly, as if she wanted it to stay sharp. Then she asked me about my classes, my filing system at work, and the oldest document I had touched that month. No one else in my family asked that kind of question. Marcia asked whether I was dating anyone yet, and whether my hair needed softening around my face. Dawn asked if my county job had benefits, as though benefits were the only dignified part of it. Travis asked if I could find old mortgage records faster than the public website, and only when one of his clients needed help. Ruth asked what a record could protect. That evening, I told her about an 1,898 deed written in brown ink that had survived a flood because someone had wrapped the book in oilcloth and carried it upstairs before the water came in. Ruth listened with both hands folded over the quilt. Where Marcia called me quiet, Ruth called me exact. Where Dawn called me a filing girl, Ruth treated me like the only person in the family who understood that a document was not dead just because it waited in a drawer. She did not flatter me. That mattered. Compliments in my family often had hooks in them. Ruth gave observations. She watched how I lined up my teacup with the edge of the porch rail. She watched me fold a receipt along its original crease instead of forcing a new one. She saw the parts of me everyone else tried to shrink into usefulness. Before I left, she took my hand and placed it on the blue border of the quilt. The cotton felt cool at first, then warmer beneath my palm. The stitches were small, nearly even, but not machine perfect. Ruth said women in our family had survived by remembering what others tried to simplify. I did not know she had already begun preparing for a day when memory would have to become proof. The spring after I turned 24, my parents forgot my acceptance dinner for a graduate certificate program in archives administration. I had told them 3 times. Marcia had written it on the kitchen calendar in purple pen. Don had said we would go somewhere with cloth napkins, which, in our family, meant he intended to claim generosity in public. Then Travis sold 2 cars in one afternoon at the dealership where he worked before moving into mortgage lending, and my parents took him to a steakhouse instead. I received a text from Marcia 3 hours late. It said she hoped I understood. Travis had a big day. We would do mine soon. Soon was a room my mother put things in when she wanted them to disappear. I sat on the narrow balcony of my apartment with a grocery store cupcake in a plastic clamshell. The frosting tasted like shortening and blue dye. My neighbor's dryer vent blew warm, lint-scented air across the railing. At 8:32 p.m., Ruth's old Buick pulled into the parking lot. She had driven 28 minutes down the mountain with the quilt folded in the passenger seat. When she knocked, she had a bakery box under one arm and the quilt under the other. It smelled of lavender soap, cedar, chestwood, and the faint iron scent of new needlework. She said nothing about my parents at first. She set the bakery box on my small kitchen counter and asked for 2 plates. We ate chocolate cake with real buttercream. I know because it left a clean film on the fork, not the waxy one from the grocery cupcake. Ruth drank tea from a mug that said Asheville Public Library Book Sale 2012, and I watched steam blur her glasses. Then she carried the quilt to the balcony, shook it once, and wrapped it around my shoulders. The cotton was heavier than it looked. Blue squares, white strips, a border with tiny repeating marks, I assumed were decoration. Ruth pressed the corner seam between my fingers. The seam had a small raised place where the stitching changed direction. She looked at me, not past me, and said, "When they forget, let something honest remember." I kept the quilt folded on the cedar chest she gave me the next year. I did not know then that the border held more than patience. By 29, I had become the kind of county records archivist people asked for by name when the online index failed them. I wore my dark hair in a low knot at work, partly because old paper did not need loose strands falling into it, and partly because it kept my face simple. Before opening any document box, I tapped the lid twice with my fingertips, not for luck, for attention. One dispute stayed with me. 3 families had been arguing over property lines near Weaverville after a developer claimed a widow's 2.7 acres were part of an adjacent tract. The mistake came from a 1,976 indexing error, 1 wrong surname, 1 plat filed under a maiden name, and 4 decades of tax maps copied from earlier tax maps until the error looked official. I spent 11 days comparing deed books, tax maps, marriage certificates, estate filings, and handwritten margin notes. The basement smelled of copier toner, old glue, and the mineral chill that came from concrete walls after rain. The fluorescent lights clicked every 19 seconds above my desk. I know because on the 3rd night, when the county attorney thought we were out of options, I counted the clicks to keep myself from rushing. The answer was not in the clean file. It almost never was. It was in a misfiled plat under the widow's mother's maiden name, tucked behind a road abandonment petition from 1981. The paper had a soft, cloth-like edge and a coffee stain shaped like a thumb. I laid the plat beside the tax map, then beside the marriage certificate, then beside the deed book reference, and the chain came back into alignment, one page at a time. At the meeting, the widow's hands shook when she signed the corrected affidavit. They stopped shaking after the third signature. The county attorney nodded once. The developer's representative closed his binder without a word. I went back downstairs afterward and reshelved box 18B because the work was not finished just because someone had finally seen it. That was what Ruth understood. Precision was not decoration, it was shelter. Some people inherit houses. I inherited the map. On Saturday, June 14, when the quitclaim deed appeared on the projector screen, I was seated at table 17 at the Grove Park Inn, 2 rows from the back, beside Aunt Elaine Mercer and across from Frank Holloway. My parents had placed Travis at the front table with them, where his expensive loafers without socks were visible every time he crossed one ankle over the other. The banquet had been arranged as if Marcia had personally invented marriage. Cream tablecloths, gold chargers, 35 white roses in low vases, a display of framed photographs from 1989 through 2026. The sweet smell of buttercream had begun to thicken under the warm lights, and the salad plates still held streaks of vinaigrette when Marcia stood to introduce what she called the legacy and sacrifice portion of the evening. I thought it would be a slideshow of my parents building Whitaker Roofing, buying their first house, baptizing 2 children, posing beside church Christmas trees, and standing at the lake club like membership was proof of moral discipline. For 6 minutes, it was. Then the screen changed. A scanned deed filled the wall behind the cake table. I noticed the notary stamp first. That was not emotion. That was training. The stamp sat too close to the signature block, and the commission number had a spacing pattern I had seen before in rejected filings. Then I saw the inconsistent gap between my first name and middle initial. Then the signature angle, too steep by at least 15 degrees. Then the date. The date said I had signed in Asheville. I had been in Raleigh that day at a records preservation seminar, 247 miles away, wearing a blue badge on a lanyard and eating a boxed turkey sandwich at 12:40 p.m., while a lecturer explained disaster recovery for water-damaged ledgers. My palm pressed flat to the tablecloth. I counted 6 breaths. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The projector fan clicked. A fork stopped against porcelain. Aunt Elaine's purse chain made a small metallic sound as her hand tightened. Frank Holloway looked from the screen to me and then down at his coffee cup. My father stood near the projector with his sun-browned hands around the microphone. There was sawdust under his thumbnail. There almost always was, even at formal events. He said the cabin sale would close Friday at 4 p.m. He said families survived by sacrifice. He said some people took longer to understand that than others. Then Marcia, in cream silk with pearl earrings, lifted one hand toward me like a queen pardoning a servant. She said, "Lena has always needed help understanding what family requires." People laughed softly because they thought they were supposed to. I folded my napkin once. Not neatly. Once. At 8:13 p.m., I stepped into the hotel corridor near the service elevators and called Margaret Caldwell, the Buncombe County Register of Deeds. The hallway smelled like carpet shampoo and beef au jus from the banquet kitchen. A bus cart rattled past with 24 empty plates stacked in uneven towers, and one server whispered an apology though she had done nothing wrong. Margaret answered on the 4th ring. She was 58, with silver reading glasses on a chain and a habit of pausing 3 seconds before giving an official answer. I had worked with her long enough to know those pauses were not hesitation. They were quality control. I did not start with my parents. I started with book and page. I read the numbers from the photo I had taken of the screen under the table. My thumb left a faint butter mark on the phone case because I had touched the edge of my dessert plate before taking the picture. Margaret asked me to repeat the book number. I did. There was typing, then silence. 1 second, 2, 3. Margaret did not comfort me first. That was one of the reasons I trusted her. She said the deed presented at the banquet was not the controlling original. She said Ruth Whitaker had recorded a protected deed structure in 2018, retained the original instrument with the county clerk, and attached a notarized video statement naming me as the intended cabin holder. She said the transfer packet connected to the new quit claim had not yet been finally released for closing because it was pending verification. I stood beside a beige wall with a brass service sign and felt my breathing slow until it seemed to belong to someone else. Margaret asked whether the deed had been presented publicly. Yes. Whether I had a photograph. Yes. Whether anyone had stated a closing date. Friday, at 4 p.m. This time, her pause lasted 4 seconds. She told me that if no formal challenge was filed, the county would release the deed transfer packet for closing. The buyer would take possession Monday morning. She gave me the number the way she would give a court deadline, exact and unsentimental. From the moment I hung up, I had 5 days, 20 hours, and 18 minutes. When I returned to the banquet room, Don was lifting a champagne glass and thanking the loyal children who understood sacrifice. He turned toward Travis, not me. Travis smiled with his mouth closed, the same way he smiled in loan officer photos when he wanted clients to believe paperwork was simple because he had already decided what mattered. Marcia moved from table to table with a small brass plaque in her hand. She had already ordered it for the cabin buyer's closing gift. It read, Whitaker Family Legacy, 1981 to 2026. She showed it to table 3 before dessert, as if the cabin had already been emptied of Ruth's breath, Ruth's receipts, Ruth's porch smoke, Ruth's handwriting on masking tape labels. Robert Hartley, the buyer's closing attorney, stood near the side wall with a black leather portfolio under one arm. Clean-shaven, navy suit, careful eyes. Caroline Price, the buyer's representative, checked something on a tablet in a gray case. She looked efficient, not cruel. That mattered later. Don tapped the fake deed packet with 2 fingers and told Robert the family was all aligned now. All aligned. That was the phrase he used when dissent had been buried rather than resolved. I did not confront Travis. I did not interrupt Marcia. I did not ask my father whether he understood that a forged signature was not a family disagreement. Loud people often mistake the first silence after a lie for success. I saved the slideshow photo. I recorded the remainder of Don's remarks from my phone under the table. The microphone made his voice slightly tinny, but the words were clear. I collected the printed banquet program from beneath my water glass, where condensation had softened the corner. I photographed the fake deed packet when Travis left it unattended near the cake table for 2 minutes and 14 seconds, while he went to laugh with a roofing client. Then, I asked him to email me a copy for my records. He looked pleased. That was useful. At 10:06 p.m., the email arrived with the subject line, Dad asked me to send this. It had 3 attachments: quitclaim scan, closing estimate, cabin transfer notes. I did not open them in the ballroom. I put my phone face down beside my plate and listened while 180 people applauded a transaction that did not belong to the people selling it. The next morning, Sunday, June 15, at 9:06 a.m., I unlocked the county archive building. The street outside was still quiet. Asheville has a way of smelling like wet stone after early rain, even in June. Inside, the archive smelled of dust, copier toner, and the metallic chill of old shelving. The lights came on in 3 rows. First the front desk, then the research tables, then the stacks. I wore flat shoes and brought coffee in a steel thermos. I did not bring the speech I should have given my parents. Speech was not the tool I needed. I pulled the deed index first, then Ruth's estate file references, then the notary logs, then my seminar attendance documentation from Raleigh, registration receipt, hotel folio, badge scan, 2 time-stamped emails, and the session sign-in sheet from the preservation workshop where my name appeared in blue ink between a clerk from Durham and a librarian from Wilson. At 10:38 a.m., Marcus Bell called. Marcus was 33, a high school history teacher, and the only person I knew who could sit with silence without trying to decorate it. He wore rolled shirt sleeves even when he was not at work, and brought coffee in 2 cups even when I said I was fine. He had proposed 4 months earlier near the French Broad River with a ring he had carried for 19 days because he wanted the moment to be quiet enough for me to believe it. I told him the short version. He asked what I needed. I said copies, timestamps, and someone to drive if my hands got too stiff from sorting. He said he was leaving in 5 minutes, not coming to rescue me. Leaving, in 5 minutes. There is a difference. At 11:44 a.m., I returned to Ruth's quilt, not the cloth itself at first. The slideshow photograph. In the background of one anniversary slide, behind Ruth's old rocker, the quilt hung over the cedar chest in her cabin. I had seen that photograph before, but never enlarged on a projector, never with urgency sharpening every stitch. There was a single blue thread marker in the border, not accidental. Ruth's stitches were careful, and the blue thread sat at an angle against the white cotton like a small arrow. It pointed toward a border pattern I had always mistaken for decoration. 3 squares, then a gap, then 18 small blue stitches. I sat back from the screen. The room hummed around me. The copier warmed behind the counter with a plastic smell. Somewhere overhead, old pipes clicked twice. 3, 18, box, 3-1-8. Ruth had used that notation for courthouse archive boxes for years. She had helped neighbors trace deeds before online indexes made people think searching was the same thing as knowing. She had stitched the box number into the border and left the marker visible in a family photograph because she knew, somehow, that I would look closely when everyone else looked only for sentiment. The quilt did not solve the case. It pointed. That was more Ruth's way. She never did the work for me. She made sure I knew where to begin. If this story is hitting close to home, comment thread below. Now back to the story. I walked to the 3rd row of county-held estate archive boxes. The metal shelf was cold beneath my palm. My shoes made no sound on the sealed concrete floor. I found box 3-1-8 at shoulder height, tapped the lid twice, and lifted it down. Inside were 7 folders, each labeled in Ruth's hand, or by the clerk who had processed the retained instrument. The folder I needed had a courthouse receipt clipped to the front, the number Ruth had made me repeat on her porch in 2018, twice. The paper inside smelled of old cotton, toner, and the faint, dusty sweetness of files that had not been opened often. I put on gloves. I turned each page from the bottom corner. There was the original deed structure. There was the certified retention notice. There was the reference to Ruth's notarized video statement. There was the chain, clean as a path through snow. At 12:10 p.m., Marcus arrived carrying a legal pad, a turkey sandwich, and 2 coffees. He did not ask if I was okay. People ask that when they need a simple answer. He set the sandwich beside my left hand and said, quietly, that he had brought extra tabs. That landed harder than comfort would have. For 4 hours, Marcus labeled copies, time-stamped screenshots, and drove between my apartment, the archive, and the office supply store while I sorted the evidence into a sequence that a stranger could follow. He wrote times in the margins when I dictated them. He stapled nothing unless I told him to. He did not touch original paper with bare hands after I explained why. At 3:27 p.m., Marcia posted 14 banquet photos on Facebook. Aunt Elaine sent me screenshots before I saw them myself. In one, my parents stood beneath the projector screen with Travis between them. The caption thanked everyone who celebrated 35 years of faith, family, and legacy. In another, Marcia held the brass plaque beside the anniversary cake. The comments were full of hearts, congratulations, and people saying Ruth would be smiling. Ruth would not have smiled. Ruth would have checked the filing date. On Monday, at 8:30 a.m., Margaret Caldwell met me in her office with certified copies and a written timeline. Her office smelled of black coffee and paper warmed by the morning sun. Her silver glasses hung against a navy blouse, and she read every page before sliding it toward me. The original instrument, she explained, had been retained with the county clerk after Ruth recorded the protected deed structure in 2018. The notarized video statement was attached to Ruth's estate file. The new quitclaim, the one my parents had shown at the banquet, contained defects that would have stopped the closing if properly challenged. She said the word defects with no drama. That helped. Drama blurs edges. Records sharpen them. Margaret advised me to preserve every public statement. The banquet itself, she said, might show intent. Dawn had announced a closing date. Marcia had presented the transaction as completed. Travis had transmitted the packet to me. Robert Hartley and Caroline Price had been present for portions of the celebration and had reason to rely on the family's representations. I asked whether Caroline knew the title was disputed. Margaret said not yet, but she would. On Tuesday morning, Robert Hartley was contacted because his client could not close if the seller's title was under challenge. At 1:22 p.m., he replied, requesting documentation. His email was polite, narrow, and clean. He did not accuse. Attorneys rarely need adjectives when nouns will do. At 2:05 p.m., Dawn texted me for the first time since the banquet. It said, "Don't make this hard on your mother." There was no punctuation. At 2:18 p.m., Travis texted a thumbs-up emoji and the words, "Don't make this weird." I took screenshots of both. On Wednesday, Dawn joked at a roofing estimate that the cabin sale would patch every old leak. The client, who knew June Whitaker from church, repeated it to her. June repeated it to Aunt Elaine. Aunt Elaine called me at 6:40 p.m. while I was sorting witness names at my kitchen table. Aunt Elaine was 64, Ruth's younger sister, with a silver braid pinned at the back of her head and a purse full of church bulletins she collected, like small proof that she had been present. She did not speak quickly. She told me Ruth had said more than once that the cabin was meant to stay with me. I asked how many people heard it. She paused. 12, she said. Thanksgiving after the storm. Ruth had been sitting by the window because her knees hurt. I wrote it down. Aunt Elaine told me she would say it if asked. I believed her. Frank Holloway called 17 minutes later. He had been Ruth's handyman for years and had subcontracted for Dawn before the invoices started arriving late. He always kept a pencil tucked behind his ear, even in church, and the last time I saw him he had white paint on his right cuff from repairing a porch rail. Frank told me Ruth had changed the cabin locks and deed box labels in 2018 because she did not trust Dawn's pressure around property. His voice had gravel in it. He said he had watched Ruth write new labels for 4 boxes, and that she had told him the cabin was to stay with me because I treated records as promises. I wrote that down too. By Thursday, the evidence had become a stack 2 inches thick. Not chaos, sequence. Ruth's deed, Ruth's notarized video transcript, the fake quitclaim, the notary log mismatch, my Raleigh seminar receipt, my hotel folio, my attendance badge, Travis's emailed packet, Dawn's banquet remarks, Marcia's Facebook post, Frank's statement, Aunt Elaine's statement. Maggie Coleman's note that Ruth had discussed the quilt with her while stitching the border. Maggie was 54, Ruth's former neighbor and a retired elementary school secretary who carried a green cardigan over her arm no matter the weather. She remembered the quilt being made because Ruth had brought it to Maggie's porch during 3 afternoons in 2019. And talked about how some women had to leave directions inside ordinary things. At 11:37 p.m., Thursday night, I sat at my kitchen table with the quilt folded beside the certified deed packet. That was the first time I had unfolded the cloth itself since finding the marker in the photo. The room smelled like cold coffee and rain on asphalt. The paper edges rasped against my fingertips as I placed each document into order. Ruth's stitches caught on the dry skin near my thumb. One blue thread in the border was slightly raised where the marker had been anchored. I pressed my thumb against that blue stitch. The guest list from the banquet lay to my right. 180 names. Relatives, church friends, roofing clients, neighbors, people who had watched me be corrected in public for an act I had never committed. People who would have accepted the sale because accepting my parents' version was easier than looking at a daughter who did not behave like a villain. For exactly 30 seconds, I let myself consider silence. I watched the second hand move from 7 to 37. Silence would have preserved Sunday dinners, or the appearance of them. Silence would have spared church hallways. Silence would have let old neighbors keep telling me to honor my parents without asking what honor had cost. Silence would have allowed the buyer to take possession Monday morning, and my father to turn forged paper into debt relief. It would have been easier in the way a locked room is easier than a long road. At 9:12 a.m., Friday, Margaret called to confirm that the certified copies were ready. She would attend the scheduled pre-closing meeting in the Grove Park Inn side room, where Dawn and Marcia expected to celebrate with the buyer before driving to the closing office. Her final instruction was procedural. Bring identification, bring the original notice packet, and do not surrender the quilt or any document to your parents. I placed my driver's license in the front pocket of my bag. I placed the certified copies in a hard-sided folder. I folded the quilt over my left arm the way Ruth used to fold laundry from the line. Corners matched, weight balanced, no hurry. At 2:21 p.m., Marcus drove me to the Grove Park Inn. Neither of us spoke for the first 9 minutes. Rain had left the road dark in patches. His truck smelled like coffee, chalk dust, and the peppermint gum he chewed when he was trying not to ask too much. At a red light, he reached over and tapped the folder once, not the hand holding it. He said they had made the mistake of forgetting what I did for a living. I looked at the hotel entrance ahead, stone and glass and old money arranged against the mountain. At 2:48 p.m., I stepped back into the same banquet wing, not as the forgotten daughter, but as the archivist carrying the original record. The room smelled like lemon polish, coffee, and lilies from reused anniversary centerpieces. Ice knocked softly inside water pitchers. The carpet was thick enough that I heard voices before footsteps, and the quilt in my arms felt heavier than its 4 pounds, because every fold held Ruth's work. 180 people had witnessed the lie on Saturday. 41 were present Friday. 41 people who had heard Dawn's version. 41 people who thought they were watching me apologize. The side room was smaller than the banquet hall, but Marcia had tried to give it the same authority. Cream tablecloths, a cake knife display from the anniversary dinner, white lilies in 5 vases, a framed photograph of Ruth's cabin placed near the signing table, as if the building itself had consented. Marcia stood beside the cake knife display in cream silk, wearing the same pearl earrings from Saturday. When she saw the quilt, her smile tightened for half a second, then returned sharper. Dawn stood near the projector with Travis, laughing too loudly with Robert Hartley and Caroline Price. His laugh stopped 1 beat late when I entered. That is a useful detail. People who know they are clean do not need an extra second to arrange their faces. Travis looked at the quilt, then at my folder, then at Dawn. His loafers were polished. No socks, the same careless confidence. Maggie Coleman sat near the back, with her green cardigan folded across her lap. Frank Holloway stood by the coffee station, pencil behind his ear, white paint still visible on his right cuff. Aunt Elaine Mercer sat near the aisle with her silver braid pinned neatly and her purse upright between her shoes. June Whitaker was near the wall, adjusting one hearing aid as the room grew tense. Robert Hartley had his black leather portfolio open. Caroline Price held her tablet in its gray case, face calm but watchful. Marcia clapped her hands once. The sound was too bright. She said everyone was glad I had come to put this family matter behind us. She did not ask if I wanted water. She did not ask if I understood what was about to happen. She framed my arrival as cooperation, because that was how she had survived for years, naming a thing before anyone else could see it clearly. Don motioned toward the signing table. He said I should thank everyone for their patience, sign the final acknowledgement, and stop dragging county dust into family business. A few people gave small, polite laughs. Not Maggie, not Frank, not Aunt Elaine. Marcia stepped forward, pearls catching the overhead light. Her perfume reached me before she did, powdery and sharp beneath the lilies. She placed one hand over her heart, a gesture she used often at church when collecting casseroles and secrets. Then she said, "After everything we have done for you, Lena, don't stand here acting ungrateful." There it was. The word she had used Saturday. The word she had spent my whole life preparing to throw in public. Maggie Coleman pressed 2 fingers to her mouth. Frank Holloway lowered his coffee cup without drinking. Aunt Elaine Mercer reached for the back of a chair. Robert Hartley stopped writing mid-word. Travis looked at the floor for 4 seconds, then at Dawn. I counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4. The room waited for me to break, argue, apologize, or leave. I did none of those things. I smoothed the quilt once with my right hand. The cotton made a soft sound against the table, almost like a page turning. Then I asked for the projector remote. Don laughed, not because anything was funny, because he needed the room to believe he still understood the shape of it. Marcia touched her pearl earring. Robert Hartley looked at Caroline Price. Caroline gave him a small nod. He picked up the remote from beside the laptop and placed it on the table halfway between us. I laid the quilt down first. Not as evidence. Never as evidence. Cloth could remember, but the county needed seals. The quilt was the path Ruth had left me to the proof, the same blue and white weight she had wrapped around my shoulders after my parents chose Travis's celebration over mine. I set it beside the certified deed copy, folded so the border showed 3 squares, a gap, and 18 small blue stitches. Then I placed the documents in a clean stack, colored tabs, blue for Ruth's retained instrument, yellow for the notarized video transcript, red for the challenged quitclaim, green for the notary log, white for my Raleigh records, gray for witness statements. Margaret Caldwell stepped beside me with the county seal packet. She had entered quietly through the side door 3 minutes earlier, silver reading glasses on a chain, navy blouse, no expression beyond professional attention. I had never been so relieved to see a person look unimpressed. I kept my hands flat on the table. Then I looked at my mother, my father, my brother, the buyer's representative, the attorney, the witnesses, and the framed photograph of Ruth's cabin. I am not here to discuss gratitude. I am here to correct the record. Pause here. What do you think happens next? Drop your guess in the comments. A. Marcia apologizes. B. Don doubles down. Or C. The buyer walks. And subscribe if you haven't, because the next 10 minutes are the reason this story exists. I did not accuse first. I identified the document by book, page, date, notary, and signature line. I said the deed shown Saturday was not the controlling record and could not support the closing. I said the quitclaim packet contained a signature attributed to me on a date when I was in Raleigh at a records preservation seminar. I said the notary stamp on that document did not match the active commission record for that date. My voice did not rise. It did not need to. Margaret opened the county seal packet. The room shifted, not loudly, but with that small collective sound people make when they realize a family argument has just become an institutional proceeding. She stated that the certified deed retained by the county predated the alleged quitclaim. She stated that Ruth Whitaker's notarized video had been recorded in 2018 and attached to the estate file. She stated that the signature on the new quitclaim conflicted with my verified signature records. She stated that the notary stamp did not match the active commission record for that date. Then she gave the sentence that changed the air in the room. The county cannot release a transfer packet supported by an instrument under credible signature challenge and conflicting certified record. No one spoke for 7 seconds. I counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Don's jaw worked twice before sound came out. The color drained from the skin around Marcia's mouth, leaving her lipstick suddenly too bright. Travis's right hand started trembling against his phone, and he locked the screen though no one had called him. Caroline Price lowered her tablet. Robert Hartley removed his glasses. Maggie Coleman opened her purse and removed a folded card. She did not interrupt. She held it against her chest with both hands. Later, I learned Ruth had written it in 2019, after Maggie helped her carry groceries up the porch steps. On the back, Ruth had written that the cabin was Lena's safety because Lena knew how to keep a record straight. Frank Holloway stepped closer to the table. He did not perform outrage. He was a man who had measured beams, repaired porch rails, and watched people lie about invoices. His voice came out plain. Ruth told him in 2018, the cabin was to stay with me because I was the only one who treated records as promises. Aunt Elaine lifted her chin. Her purse full of church bulletins sat at her feet like a small archive of Sundays. She told Marcia that Ruth had said the same thing after Thanksgiving, with 12 people in the room. She named 4 of them before Marcia could say she must be remembering wrong. June Whitaker adjusted her hearing aid and looked down at her hands. Robert Hartley turned to Caroline Price and advised that his client could not proceed with the purchase. His voice was careful, but not soft. The buyer could not close on a deed with a contested signature and conflicting certified record. He closed his portfolio with 2 hands. That sound carried. Don said, "That's impossible." Ruth was confused at the end. Margaret did not blink. She confirmed the video was notarized in 2018, 2 years before Ruth's death, and before the decline Don was trying to imply. She said the chain of custody never passed through me personally. The original deed stayed with the county clerk. Marcia said, "Lena works in records. She could have arranged any of this." There was the second defense. Cleaner than Don's, crueler, because it tried to turn competence into suspicion. Margaret answered that the retained instrument was recorded through county process in 2018. The notarized video was logged independently, and the certified chain could not be altered by an employee after the fact without leaving audit records. She had those records present. Travis cleared his throat. His voice came out weak. He said maybe everyone should calm down and talk at home. That was the third defense. Not denial, relocation. A home is where families like mine moved hard truths when the public room stopped protecting them. Marcus, standing near the door, did not speak. He did not have to. Aunt Elaine did. She turned toward Travis and said the room was calm already. Then she looked at me, not with pity, with recognition. I placed my Raleigh records beside the quit claim. Hotel receipt, seminar registration, attendance badge, sign-in sheet, mileage from Asheville to Raleigh, 247 miles. The fake quit claim claimed I had signed in Asheville on the same afternoon I had been 247 miles away, learning how to salvage mold-damaged maps. Margaret confirmed each document in sequence. Robert Hartley asked who had provided the quit claim packet. Caroline Price looked at Dawn. Dawn looked at Marcia. Marcia looked at Travis. Nobody looked at me. That sequence said more than any confession would have said in that moment. Caroline's face changed first. Not anger, containment. A professional woman realizing she had been invited into a public celebration of a transaction built on rot. She tapped her tablet 3 times and said her office would preserve all communications. Don spread his hands. He said families handled things informally all the time. He said Ruth had wanted everyone taken care of. He said the cabin sale was necessary because the company had obligations. He said I did not understand what it meant to carry debt, payroll, reputation, a name. He used 12 sentences. Margaret needed one. A forged signature does not become valid because a seller has bills. The room went still again. This time, I did not count. I looked at Marcia. I said she had called me ungrateful because she thought gratitude meant surrender. My hands stayed flat on the table. I did not smile. There was nothing in that room to smile at, not even victory if that is what someone wanted to call it. Dawn's face reddened around the ears. Marcia's fingers had tightened around the back of a chair until her knuckles looked polished. Travis kept looking at the documents like they might rearrange themselves if he waited long enough. Robert Hartley advised Caroline that the buyer's side would withdraw from Friday's closing and preserve all communications. Caroline nodded once and said she would notify the investor immediately. Her voice was controlled, but I saw the flush at the base of her neck. Embarrassment has a temperature. In that room, it ran hot and quiet. The framed photograph of Ruth's cabin sat beside the projector, angled slightly toward the lilies. In the picture, the porch rail still had the old chip near the second post. Frank had fixed that rail later. Ruth had refused to let Dawn do it because, she said, a favor was not free just because no invoice arrived. Marcia tried one more time. She said this was not the time to punish the family. I looked at the fake quitclaim, then at the quilt, then at the certified deed. Punishment was not the word for refusing theft, but I did not say that. I look. Not then. I said, there are remedies available today that I am not asking Margaret to initiate in this room. Don heard hesitation. His shoulders loosened by half an inch. Marcia heard weakness. Her mouth tightened with the old familiar expectation that if she pressed hard enough, I would become easier to manage. Travis heard a door. For the first time that afternoon, he looked at me like I might choose whether the house survived the week. That was the moment the room changed again. Not because my parents understood what they had done. They did not. Not fully. Maybe not ever. It changed because the 41 people present finally understood that I had more power than I was using. The buyer walked. The forged transfer stopped. The cabin remained where Ruth had left it, above Black Mountain, under old trees, with cedar smoke in the boards and a box number stitched into cotton, because one woman knew another woman would someday need a map. Truth does not shout. It waits for a seal. After Caroline Price and Robert Hartley left the side room, the air seemed larger and emptier. The lilies still smelled too sweet. Coffee had gone bitter in the urn. Someone had abandoned a slice of cake near the window, frosting drying at the edge. Of the 41 people who had watched the reveal, Only 9 remained close enough to hear what came next. Maggie stood near Aunt Elaine. Frank stayed by the wall. June sat with both hands around a paper cup. Travis had not moved from the table. Marcus stood behind me, just far enough away that no one could pretend he was speaking for me. Margaret Caldwell stayed too. She did not hover. She waited, which was different. Don sat down for the first time. The chair legs scraped softly against the carpet. He looked older without an audience. Not harmless, just older. Marcia remained standing. She adjusted one pearl earring, then dropped her hand when she realized I had noticed. I told them what I was not doing. I was not asking counsel in that room to pursue immediate remedies tied to the fraudulent transaction. I was not moving that afternoon to apply pressure that would threaten their paid-off house because of the lien and loan structure they had attached to the expected sale. I was not asking Margaret to begin every available referral before my parents had time to cooperate with correcting the packet. Don's eyes narrowed. He understood debt faster than he understood dignity. Marcia said nothing. I opened the final folder. It contained the draft occupancy agreement my attorney had reviewed that morning. 12 months. No sale. No transfer. No further claim to the cabin. Full cooperation in correcting the fraudulent deed packet. Production of all communications with the buyer, the buyer's representatives, and anyone involved in preparing or circulating the quitclaim. Written acknowledgement that the cabin was not family sale property. No public representation otherwise. The agreement allowed Marcia and Don to remain in their paid-off house for 12 months, while Don restructured the roofing company debt. It was not forgiveness. It was shelter with terms. I looked at them both and said, I could make you leave the house before you learn how to tell the truth about it. I am choosing not to. I haven't. Don stared at me. He asked why I would do that if I had the papers. That was the first honest question he had asked all week. Marcia looked insulted before she looked relieved. Mercy, to her, felt like being seen too clearly. Her face changed in 3 stages: offense, calculation, recognition. She said I was trying to humiliate them. My answer was simple. Humiliation was Saturday. This was housing. Don sat down slowly, his knees touching the underside of the conference table. The small impact made the water glasses tremble. He did not thank me. I did not expect him to. He looked at the quilt and said Ruth always did favor me. I told him Ruth favored preparation. That was as warm as I could make the truth. Margaret reviewed the agreement in plain language. She explained what cooperation meant. She explained that the corrected record would proceed regardless of whether my parents liked the feeling of it. She explained that if they violated the agreement, the remedies I had not chosen that afternoon could return. That is record. Don signed first. His signature was heavy and uneven. Marcia signed after reading the first page 3 times, and the last paragraph once. Her pen made a small tear in the paper where she pressed too hard at the end of her last name. Travis did not sign that document. He was not a party to the house agreement, but he watched every stroke of my parents' pens, and for once, no one asked him to make it easier for them. 9 days later, a letter arrived at my apartment in Marcia's handwriting. It came in a cream envelope that smelled faintly of perfume and rain. The address was centered perfectly. My name was spelled correctly. That should not have mattered at 31, but I noticed. The letter was 3 pages long. Only 5 sentences mattered. Marcia admitted she knew I had not signed the deed. She wrote that things had become desperate. She wrote that Don's company debts were larger than people understood. She wrote that Travis had found an old signature sample. She wrote that they believed I would not fight them publicly. She did not say she was sorry clearly. I read the letter twice, at my kitchen table. The first time as a daughter, the second time as an archivist. The second reading was more useful. I placed it in a folder labeled Whitaker Occupancy Agreement Correspondence. I did not frame it as forgiveness. I did not burn it. I preserved it because that is what I do with evidence and with pain. I give each thing a name, a date, and a place where it cannot keep moving around. 2 weeks after the banquet, Travis called at 10:22 p.m. I almost let it ring. Marcus was grading essays at the other end of the table, red pen in hand, a cup of tea cooling near his elbow. The apartment smelled like paper, mint tea, and the rain that had followed us all month. I answered on the 5th ring. Travis's voice sounded smaller than it had at the banquet, not childlike. smaller in the way a room becomes smaller after furniture is removed. He admitted he had emailed Don a scanned signature sample from an old mortgage correction I had made for the family. He said Marcia told him it was just to help the attorney prepare forms. He said he had not asked enough questions. I listened. He sent the email chain while we were still on the phone. There it was. Dates. Forwarded attachments. Marcia's request. Don's reply. Travis's scan. A sentence from Don saying the signature only needed to match well enough for the packet stage because no one would make trouble before closing. No one. That was me. I told Travis he had 48 hours to give the same file to Margaret Caldwell and Robert Hartley. He asked whether that would make things worse. I said it would make them truer. He did it. For once, that helped. 6 months later, Don had lost 3 roofing contracts after clients learned the cabin sale collapsed over a forged deed packet. He kept Whitaker Roofing open, but only after selling equipment, ending the Lake Club membership, and entering a debt restructuring plan. Marcia stepped down from the church hospitality committee after Aunt Elaine refused to let the story be softened into a family misunderstanding. Their marriage did not become tender. It became quieter, which is not the same thing. Travis left the mortgage office where he had used family access too casually. He was not celebrated for telling the truth late. He attended one coffee meeting with me, arrived 11 minutes early, and brought copies instead of excuses. Our relationship remained limited, but no longer false. Caroline Price's buyer withdrew cleanly and later purchased a different property. June Whitaker stopped referring roofing clients to Don but wrote me a note saying Ruth would have hated the banquet and loved the way I numbered the documents. The note came on pale blue stationery and had 2 coffee rings near the bottom edge. I returned to work at the county archive after taking 6 personal days. I was not suddenly loud. I became more exact. Margaret Caldwell recommended me for a regional preservation panel after my timeline became a training example in document integrity. Marcus stayed beside me, not as a rescuer, but as the person who knew when to bring coffee and when to leave the room quiet. The cabin was not sold. I used part of the timber lease income to repair the porch, replace the roof properly through a contractor who was not Don, and restore Ruth's cedar chest. Frank Holloway supervised the porch repair with a pencil behind his ear and corrected one young carpenter's measurement by 1/8 of an inch without raising his voice. In December, 6 months after the anniversary banquet, I stood inside Ruth's mountain cabin on a cold afternoon and hung the blue and white quilt above her cedar chest. The room smelled of cedar, fresh paint, and wood smoke. Snow tapped softly against the windows. The quilt hung where light from the west window could reach the border, including the 3 squares, the gap, and the 18 small blue stitches that had pointed me toward box 3-1/8. I ran my fingers along the cotton once, the way Ruth had pressed the corner seam into my hand on my apartment balcony years earlier. The quilt had never been a decoration. It was a witness, stitched in cotton. Below it, on the small writing desk, I placed a framed, certified copy of the deed. Not because paper is warmer than family, because sometimes paper is the only thing that keeps family from rewriting the room. Threads remember. Paper confirms. If this story stayed with you, like the video, subscribe for more quiet justice stories, and comment Blue Stitch if someone in your life ever underestimated what you were quietly keeping track of.